Hello and welcome back to LMJ English, where we bring real stories to life through language learning. If you enjoy inspiring stories that help you learn English naturally, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story when it's released. Early interest in machines. In the warm summer of 1863, in a quiet countryside of Michigan, a baby boy was born to a humble farming family. His name was Henry Ford. The Ford farm stretched across fields of green, filled with the scent of fresh hay and the steady rhythm of farm life. Most children born into farming families learned early to love the land, to wake before dawn, tend to the animals, and work with their hands in the soil. But young Henry was different. From the moment he could walk and speak, it became clear that his mind wandered elsewhere. He was not drawn to the fields or the crops. His heart beat faster, not at the sight of a sunrise over the wheat, but at the sight of something far less romantic, a machine. Henry's fascination began with the smallest things. A broken tool, a rusty wheel, a ticking clock. While other children were chasing each other in the open fields, Henry sat quietly in the barn, eyes wide, hands busy. He was not afraid to break something if it meant understanding how it worked. In fact, he often did just that. He would borrow his father's tools and take apart everything he could find, door hinges, pocket knives, even toys, carefully laying each piece out in front of him like treasure. The farm to Henry was not just land. It was a workshop filled with endless possibilities. The moment that truly changed everything came when Henry turned 13. His father gave him a gift, an elegant silver pocket watch. For many boys, this would be a prized possession to admire and wear with pride. But for Henry, it was an irresistible mystery. The moment he was alone, he opened the watch piece by tiny piece, studying the movements, the wheels, the springs. With no training, no instruction, and no guide, he took it apart and, amazingly, put it all back together. Then he did it again, and again. He became so skilled that neighbors started bringing their watches to the young boy on the farm, asking for help. Henry fixed them all, not for money, not for praise, but for joy. The joy of understanding. His mother Mary quietly supported his curiosity. She saw that her son was different, gentle, thoughtful, endlessly curious. When others called him lazy for not working the fields, she knew better. She saw the way he lit up around machinery, the way his fingers moved like they were born for screws and bolts, not seeds and soil. Sadly, she passed away when Henry was still young, leaving a quiet emptiness in his heart. After her death, the farm felt even less like home to him. Without her gentle encouragement, the fields became colder, the work heavier, the silence louder. School could not hold Henry's interest either. He thought the lessons were slow, the topics dull. He preferred to learn by doing. He left school at just 15 years old, not out of rebellion, but out of purpose. His education would come from experience, from mistakes, from hands-on discovery. He convinced his brothers and friends to help him build water wheels and small engines. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they exploded. But every failure taught him something new. Henry's early life was not one of grand inventions or fame. It was a quiet, determined childhood, spent listening to the heartbeat of machines. In barns and workshops, in sheds and silent fields, he was already building the foundation of a life that would change the world. His dreams did not begin in factories or boardrooms. They began in a small pocket watch, ticking gently in the hands of a boy who refused to stop asking, "How does this work?" Early experiments and steam engines, the winds that swept across the Michigan farmland, carried more than dust. They carried the quiet dreams of a young boy named Henry Ford. By the time Henry was 16, he had already made a bold decision. He would not follow the footsteps of his father into farming. The soil held no mystery for him. What fascinated him were the machines, the hum, the clatter, the whisper of gears spinning in perfect rhythm. With nothing but a few tools in his pocket and a burning curiosity in his heart, Henry left the family farm and stepped into the unknown world of Detroit. Detroit was noisy, smoky, and alive with invention. Henry found work in a small factory, but after only 6 days he lost his job. Alone in the city, without money or direction, he could have given up. But he didn't. His father, though disappointed in Henry's decision to leave the farm, still believed in his son. He reached out to an old friend who owned a machine shop and helped Henry get a job as a repairman. It was a turning point. In that shop, surrounded by gears, engines, and the metallic scent of oil and iron, Henry found his true classroom. Every broken machine was a lesson. Every successful repair was a quiet triumph. At night, to make extra money, he repaired jewelry in a tiny room he rented above a shop. While other boys his age were chasing fun, Henry was chasing knowledge. He didn't sleep much, but he didn't. His mind was alive with ideas. One winter, back on the farm for a short visit, a neighbor approached him with a problem. A steam engine had broken down. Though Henry had never worked on one before, he smiled and said, "I'll take a look." He studied the great hissing machine, touched its worn edges, and listened. Within hours, it was working again. That moment, simple as it was, made something click inside him. This was what he was meant to do. Not follow, not farm, but fix, build, and eventually invent. Soon after, Henry was hired by Westinghouse, a respected company that made steam engines. He became a traveling repairman, moving from town to town in Michigan and Ohio. Each machine he worked on was different, some old and grumpy, others new and delicate, but he treated them all with care. He learned to listen with more than just his ears. He listened with his hands, his eyes, his intuition. But as the years passed, Henry began to notice something troubling. Steam engines, though powerful, were not perfect. They were enormous, heavy, slow to start, and difficult to maintain. They worked well for factories and trains, but what about something smaller? What about a machine that could move people, not across cities, but across the countryside? He remembered the steam-powered tractor he had seen in Detroit years ago, and that memory lit a fire in him. Could he build something like that? Something better? Every winter, when travel slowed and work was light, Henry returned to his workshop. He filled the air with the sound of hammers and saws, the hiss of boiling water, and the hopeful silence between attempts. He scavenged scrap metal, old parts, and anything that looked remotely useful. His workshop was no grand laboratory. It was a shed, often cold, dimly lit, and cluttered with failed experiments. But for Henry it was a temple of learning. His early vehicles were strange and loud. They spat steam, rattled as they moved, and sometimes didn't move at all. Once, one of them blew apart in a small explosion. Another time, the wheels simply fell off. People laughed. "What is he building now?" they'd ask. But Henry didn't care. He kept going. He wasn't afraid of failure. He welcomed it. Because every bolt that snapped, every engine that sputtered, brought him one step closer to understanding. Still, something deep inside told him that steam wasn't the answer. It was too old, too heavy, too slow. He needed something different. Something new, something lighter, faster, smarter. One day, while repairing a strange new engine in the back of a workshop, he heard a sound he had never heard before. It wasn't the sharp hiss of steam. It was the deep, clean roar of combustion. The gasoline engine. It was smaller. It was lighter. It was powerful. And just like that, the dream of steam faded. A new dream, brighter, louder, more daring, was about to begin. Discovery of the gasoline engine. By the late 1880s, Henry Ford had spent years listening to the voice of steam, loud, clunky, and sometimes untrustworthy. He respected steam engines for what they were, powerful, strong, and revolutionary for their time. But deep in his heart, Henry knew their time was passing. Steam was heavy, complex, and slow to respond. And Henry? He was looking for something faster, something simpler, something new. Then one day, while working in a small repair shop in Detroit, Henry heard a sound that stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't the screech of metal or the whistle of steam. It was a rhythmic, steady hum like a mechanical heartbeat. He followed the sound and saw a compact machine running on its own. It didn't need firewood or water. It wasn't spitting, steam or rattling like the engines he knew. It was a gasoline engine, small, light, and full of possibility. At first, Henry was skeptical. How could something so small be powerful enough to move a vehicle? But he was curious, and curiosity was his greatest strength. So he asked questions. He examined the engine closely, touched its warm metal frame, and studied how it burned fuel and turned it into energy. The simplicity amazed him. The efficiency excited him. Unlike steam, gasoline engines didn't need time to heat up or giant boilers to power them. They could start quickly and move with precision. This was the future. Soon after, Henry got a job at the Edison Illuminating Company, a growing electrical firm founded by the legendary inventor Thomas Edison. For Henry, working under Edison was like standing in the shadow of a giant. He admired Edison deeply, not just for his inventions, but for his bold thinking and relentless energy. As a mechanic and later a chief engineer, Henry gained access to new machines, tools, and ideas. But more importantly, he had time. Time to think, time to learn, and time to build. At night, after long days at work, Henry returned home not to rest, but to create. His mind was filled with dreams of a new kind of transportation, a vehicle that didn't need horses or rails, that could run on roads and carry families. He called it his horseless carriage, and in the quiet corners of his workshop, with only a flickering lamp and his wife Clara's patient support, he began to build. It wasn't easy. He didn't have all the parts he needed, so he scavenged. He reused scrap metal, old wheels, and wooden frames. Slowly, piece by piece, he created his first working gasoline engine. It was small, loud, and ran for only a short time. But it worked. On Christmas Eve in 1893, Henry placed the little engine on the kitchen sink and ran it in front of Clara. It rattled, roared, and shook the entire room. Clara didn't scream. She smiled, because she knew this was only the beginning. Over the next 3 years, Henry worked tirelessly to build a complete vehicle around that tiny engine. He worked in a shed behind his home, often staying up late into the night, hands greasy, eyes glowing with purpose. Finally, in 1896, he completed it. A strange-looking machine with 4 bicycle wheels and a gasoline engine mounted on a frame. He called it the quadricycle. On a quiet morning in June, just after sunrise, Henry rolled the quadricycle out onto the street. His heart pounded. He climbed aboard, turned the crank, and with a loud pop the engine came to life. The machine moved. It rolled forward, fast, smooth, and strong. Neighbors watched in amazement as the horseless carriage rattled down the road at nearly 20 miles per hour. It was noisy. It was shaky. But it was a miracle. Henry had done it. He had built a working car. He sold the quadricycle not long after, using the money to fund an even better version. Because for Henry, one invention was never enough. He had seen the future, and it had 4 wheels and ran on gasoline. Initial business failures and racing success. After the success of the quadricycle, Henry Ford felt like the road ahead was finally clear. He had built a working car, and more importantly, he had proven to himself and to the world that personal transportation without horses was not just a dream. It was real. The next step, however, was much harder, turning that dream into a business. In 1899, with the help of investors who believed in his ideas, Henry founded his first company, the Detroit Automobile Company. It was an exciting time, full of hope and ambition. Henry was named the chief engineer, and he was ready to build cars for ordinary people. But very quickly things began to go wrong. The men who had invested money into the company didn't share Henry's vision. They wanted fancy cars, expensive machines for rich people. They wanted to make money fast. But Henry believed in quality. He believed that cars should be strong, reliable, and built with care. He wasn't interested in making luxury vehicles for the wealthy. He wanted to build something for everyone. This difference in vision led to arguments. Henry worked slowly, making sure every car was built well. The investors grew impatient. They pushed for more production, more speed, more profit, even if the cars weren't ready. After just 2 years, the company collapsed. Henry's first business was a failure. It closed its doors in 1901, leaving him disappointed but not defeated. Most people might have given up after such a failure, but not Henry. Instead, he looked for a new way forward. He realized something important. If he couldn't sell cars yet, he could at least prove what they were capable of. So he turned to something bold, exciting, and dangerous: racing. Henry poured his energy into building a race car. He knew that speed would attract attention. In a small workshop, he built a lightweight, powerful vehicle with a 2-cylinder engine and 26 horsepower, a massive amount at the time. He called the car Sweepstakes. In October 1901, he entered a race at the Detroit Driving Club. It was his first real race, and nobody expected him to win. But Henry surprised them all. He drove with courage and precision. The car flew across the track, and when the dust settled, Henry Ford had won. The newspapers wrote about the farm boy turned engineer who beat the odds. His name began to spread. The victory gave him more than just fame. It gave him a second chance. Some of the same investors who had doubted him before returned with renewed interest. They offered to fund a new company, this time with Henry's name on it, the Henry Ford Company. It was his second chance at building cars his way. But history began to repeat itself. The investors wanted fast profits. Henry wanted perfect machines. He became more and more focused on building even faster race cars instead of standard models. Once again, tension grew. The investors were frustrated. Finally, they asked Henry to step down. He left the company, taking with him nothing but a small amount of money and the rights to his own name. The company was renamed Cadillac, and it would go on to become one of America's most successful car brands. Henry, once again, had failed in business. But this time, he walked away with experience, vision, and the blueprints for something better. Back in his own workshop, he started over. He designed a new race car, one that would push the limits of speed. It was called the Ford 999, built with raw power and little concern for comfort. It was a beast on wheels. In 1902, it set a record by reaching 56 miles per hour, a jaw-dropping speed for the time. Henry didn't just race to win. He raced to prove something, that his cars were fast, reliable, and worth building. These thrilling victories on the track earned him respect, publicity, and most importantly, a third chance. This time, Henry Ford would take everything he had learned, every failure, every race, every argument, and use it to create something truly revolutionary. Something the world had never seen before. The Ford Motor Company and the Model T. In 1903, Henry Ford stood at the edge of his third and most important chance. He had tasted the bitterness of failure, twice, and had felt the thrill of victory on the racetrack. But deep inside, he still held on to the same dream he had nurtured since childhood, to build a car not just for the rich, but for everyone. This time, he was determined to make it real. With a small team of trusted partners and a modest amount of funding, Henry founded the Ford Motor Company. From the beginning, Henry's goal was clear. He didn't want to make fancy cars for a few wealthy people. He wanted to build something simple, reliable, and affordable, a car that a farmer could drive into town, that a teacher could park outside a school, that a factory worker could afford on his wages. It was a bold idea in a time when cars were seen as luxury items, symbols of wealth and status. But Henry believed that freedom, the freedom to travel, to move, to explore, should belong to everyone. The first car built by the new company was the Model A, a two-cylinder vehicle that sold for $750. It was a start, but Henry wasn't satisfied. He watched his workers assemble each car by hand, slowly, carefully. Only a few cars could be made each day, and the price was still too high for most people. Then one day, during a visit to a meat-packing plant in Chicago, Henry saw something that changed everything. He watched as workers processed meat in a moving line, each worker doing just one specific job. It was fast, efficient, and organized. A spark lit up in Henry's mind. What if, he thought, we build cars the same way? That simple question led to one of the most important innovations in industrial history, the assembly line. Back at his factory in Detroit, Henry began experimenting. He rearranged the workspace. Instead of having workers build entire cars, each worker would now perform one single task, over and over again, as the car moved slowly down a line. One man would attach the wheels, another would install the engine, another would tighten the bolts. The car would be built step by step, flowing like a river of metal and motion. The results were extraordinary. What once took more than 2 days now took just 90 minutes. Production increased by 500%, costs dropped, wages rose, and now, for the first time, Henry Ford could do something no one had ever done before. He could make a car that nearly anyone could afford. That car was called the Model T. Launched in 1908, the Model T was strong, simple, and easy to drive. It was built with everyday people in mind. Farmers loved it because it could handle dirt roads. Families loved it because it was safe and practical. Mechanics loved it because it was easy to repair. And most of all, people could finally afford it. To make production even faster and more consistent, Henry made a bold choice. every Model T would be the same. The same parts, the same size, the same color, black. It was a car for the masses, and America fell in love with it. The Model T didn't just change how people got from place to place, it changed how they lived. Now people could live farther, from where they worked. They could visit relatives in other towns. They could take weekend trips to the countryside. Entire industries sprang up. Gas stations, motels, diners, all because the Model T gave people the freedom to move. Sales soared. By 1914, more Ford cars were on the road than all other car brands in America combined. And over the next 2 decades, Ford would sell more than 15 million Model Ts, an achievement no one had thought possible. But perhaps the most surprising part of the story was this. As time went on, the price of the Model T went down. While most companies raised prices to increase profits, Henry did the opposite. He cut prices again and again. Why? Because he believed that the more people who could own a car, the better the world would be. The Model T was more than just a car. It was a revolution on wheels, and behind the wheel, always pushing forward, was a man who had failed, raced, learned, and dreamed, and who had finally built a machine that would carry the world into a new century. Revolutionary worker reforms. The time the Model T was rolling off assembly lines faster than anyone had thought possible, Henry Ford had already transformed the automobile industry. But in 1914, he made another bold decision, one that would not only change his company but would shake the very foundations of the working world. Life inside a Ford factory was not easy. The assembly line was fast, demanding, and repetitive. Workers stood in one spot for hours, doing the same task again and again. Many found it exhausting and dull. Some quit after just a few days. In fact, employee turnover was so high that Ford had to hire thousands of workers each year just to keep the production lines moving. Most businessmen would have blamed the workers. Most would have lowered wages to save money. But Henry Ford was not like most businessmen. He saw something others didn't. He believed that if people were treated better, paid fairly, respected, and given time to rest, they would not only work harder, they would stay. So in January of 1914, Henry Ford stunned the nation and his own investors with a shocking announcement. He would double the daily wage of his factory workers, raising it from $2.50 to $5 a day. At a time when most laborers were struggling to survive, this was unheard of. And he didn't stop there. He also reduced the workday from 9 hours to 8, and he did something even more radical. He gave his workers 2 days off each week. The 5-day workweek was born. The news spread like wildfire. Journalists called it madness. Investors were furious. "You're throwing away profit," they shouted. Shareholders took Ford to court, trying to stop the changes. But Henry stood firm. He believed in a different kind of business, one that cared not just about money but about people. And he was right. Within days, thousands of workers lined up outside Ford factories, hoping to be hired. The best workers from all over the country came to Detroit, drawn by the promise of fair wages and better conditions. Ford's factories became more stable, more productive, and more loyal. Turnover dropped, quality improved, profits soared, but there was something even deeper at work, something revolutionary. Henry Ford wasn't just paying people more, he was creating a new kind of society. With higher wages and shorter hours, workers had more time and more money. They could go out, they could travel, they could even afford the very cars they were building. For the first time, the worker became the customer. This idea changed everything. Soon other companies were forced to follow. To compete with Ford, they raised their own wages and improved conditions. Slowly, the working world began to shift. Weekends became a part of American life. Factory workers could support families, buy homes, and dream of a better future. And it all began with a single bold decision, made by a man who believed that treating people well was not just good ethics, it was good business. Of course, not everything was perfect. Ford also introduced strict rules and moral codes for his workers. He expected discipline, sobriety, and obedience. Those who didn't follow the rules could lose their jobs or be denied bonuses. But even with these controls, Henry's reforms marked a turning point in history. He had changed how cars were built. Now he was changing how people lived. The Ford Motor Company was no longer just building machines, it was building a new way of life. Later years and problems. By the time the 1920s arrived, Henry Ford had become a towering figure in American industry. He wasn't just building cars anymore, he was building history. His name was known in every household. People admired his brilliance, his determination, and his dream to bring the automobile to the common man. But behind the fame, behind the walls of his massive factories, trouble had begun to stir. The second chapter of Henry Ford's story was no longer just about success. It was about conflict, mistakes, and the painful cost of holding on too tightly to power. In 1919, Ford decided to hand over the presidency of his company to his only son, Edsel Ford. From the outside, it looked like a graceful passing of the torch. But inside the company, everyone knew the truth. Henry still pulled all the strings. He made the big decisions. He controlled the money. Edsel, though kind and intelligent, was more of a prince in a kingdom where the king refused to step down. Edsel had dreams of his own. He was modern, thoughtful, and more in touch with the changing desires of the American public. He wanted to design new cars, sleeker, more stylish, with better comfort and color. But Henry disagreed. He believed the Model T was still the best car ever made. To him, if something worked, it didn't need to be changed. He refused to accept that the world was evolving. Year after year, the arguments between father and son grew sharper. Henry would often shout at Edsel in front of others, dismissing his ideas, treating his suggestions like foolish mistakes. Edsel stayed quiet, loyal and respectful, but the pressure wore him down. Meanwhile, other car companies began to rise. General Motors, with its range of stylish models and yearly updates, started to attract more customers. The public wanted change, and Ford wasn't giving it to them. Sales of the Model T began to drop. Eventually, even Henry had to admit that it was time for something new. In 1927, he finally agreed to stop production of the Model T and introduced the Model A. It was a better car, faster, more colorful and more comfortable, but it had come too late. Ford had already lost its lead in the market. Then came the Great Depression, a time when the whole world seemed to fall apart. Banks failed, families lost their homes, millions of people were out of work. The automobile industry, like everything else, suffered deeply. Ford had to cut wages and shut down factories. Workers became desperate. Some turned to labor unions for help, organizations that fought for better pay and working conditions. But Henry Ford hated unions. He saw them as enemies, not allies. He believed they threatened his control and disrupted his carefully built empire. When workers tried to organize, Ford pushed back hard. He hired private security guards to spy on employees. He used threats and intimidation. In 1932, during a peaceful protest near the Ford River Rouge plant, a tragic event occurred. Police and company guards opened fire on unarmed workers. 4 men were killed. Dozens were injured. The event became known as the Ford Massacre. The news shocked the nation. The public, once inspired by Henry's generosity and vision, began to question him. Was this the same man who had doubled workers' wages? Who gave the world the weekend? For had power and pride blinded him to the needs of the very people who built his success? But even as the storm grew in Detroit, Henry Ford had his eyes on a very different dream, a city in the jungle. In the heart of the Amazon rainforest, Henry tried to build a place called Fordlandia. It was supposed to be a paradise, a factory, town surrounded by rubber trees that would supply the rubber needed for car tires. But it was more than a business plan. Ford wanted to create a perfect American town in the middle of Brazil. He shipped houses, white picket fences, and even sent his Midwestern values with him. No alcohol, no dancing, strict rules about behavior. It was a disaster. The jungle didn't cooperate. The rubber trees wouldn't grow properly. Insects and disease spread. The Brazilian workers, tired of the strict rules, began to revolt. Fights broke out. Buildings were destroyed. Ford lost millions of dollars. Fordlandia, like many of his later ideas, had been built on good intentions and flawed assumptions. But perhaps the darkest part of Henry Ford's legacy came not from his factories or his failed towns, but from the pages of a newspaper. In the 1920s, Henry began publishing the Dearborn Independent, a weekly paper that included a series of deeply anti-Semitic articles, hateful writings that blamed Jewish people for the world's problems. These articles spread harmful lies and fed dangerous prejudice. Tragically, these ideas reached far beyond Michigan. In Germany, a young man named Adolf Hitler read Ford's work and admired him, not for his cars, but for his hatred. Hitler even kept a portrait of Henry Ford in his office. Though Henry later apologized and shut down the paper, the damage had been done. The man who had brought mobility to millions had also given a platform to hatred, and that truth remains one of the most painful parts of his story. In 1943, Edsel Ford died suddenly from stomach cancer. He was only 49. Henry, now an old man in failing health, was heartbroken. His son was gone. His company was struggling. His legacy was uncertain. Henry tried to return and take control of the business, but he was no longer the man he used to be. His hands trembled. His mind was tired. In 1945, he stepped aside for good, and 2 years later, in 1947, Henry Ford passed away at the age of 83. He left behind a world that he had helped shape through steel, sweat, and stubbornness. He gave us affordable cars, the assembly line, and the 5-day work week, but he also left behind scars, proof that even great men can stumble, and that vision, unchecked by humility, can lead to darkness. Legacy. Henry Ford died in 1947 in the quiet town of Dearborn, Michigan, just a few miles from where he had been born more than 8 decades earlier. The world he left behind was entirely different from the one he had been born into. Horses had been replaced by engines. Dirt. Roads had turned into highways. The slow pace of the countryside had been exchanged for the fast rhythm of modern life. And at the heart of this transformation stood one man, a farm boy turned industrial giant, who had dared to imagine that every person, not just the wealthy, few deserved the power to move. But the legacy of Henry Ford is more than just machines and factories. It is a story written across time, layered with brilliance and shadow, filled with both great victories and painful missteps. His name is etched into history not just for the cars he built, but for the world he helped shape, and the lessons he left behind. Ford's greatest contribution was not a single invention, but an idea that innovation should serve the people. Before him, the automobile was a luxury, handmade, expensive, rare. After him, it became a tool of freedom, a symbol of independence. The Model T, simple and strong, rolled into driveways across America and beyond. It carried farmers to town, workers to factories, families to picnics, and dreamers into new futures. It brought mobility to the masses. Through the assembly line, Ford didn't just change car manufacturing, he changed every industry. Products could now be made faster and cheaper, which meant more people could afford them. This idea, the idea of mass production, rippled across the globe. From food to furniture, from radios to airplanes, the Ford system became the world system. And yet Henry Ford's influence reached beyond machines. He changed the relationship between workers and employers. At a time when factory workers labored for long hours and low pay, Ford did something radical. He raised wages. He shortened the workday. He gave people weekends. These decisions seemed foolish to many at the time, but they reshaped the expectations of workers everywhere. The 5-day workweek, the rhythm of life we know today, was a gift from his boldness. But as with many powerful stories, the light is accompanied by shadow. Henry Ford was a man of strong opinions, and sometimes dangerous ones. In his later years, he published anti-Semitic writings that spread harmful lies and hatred. These writings were not just forgotten words on a page. They were read by millions, including men like Adolf Hitler, who praised Ford and even kept his portrait in his office. Though Ford later distanced himself from these views, the damage had been done. It is a stain that cannot be ignored. He also resisted labor unions, sometimes with violence. While he once championed the worker, he later became the very kind of employer that workers had to fight against. In his quest for control and perfection, he lost sight of the very people who had helped build his empire. His Fordlandia project, a failed attempt to build a utopian city in the Brazilian jungle, revealed his belief that he could not only shape machines, but shape people. That belief ended in failure, rebellion, and deep financial loss. Even within his own family, Henry struggled. His relationship with his son Edsel was marked by tension, criticism, and heartbreak. Though Edsel was gentle and visionary in his own way, Henry often ignored him, believing only his own ideas mattered. When Edsel died young in 1943, it was a wound Henry never truly recovered from, and yet, despite all this, the name Ford endures. Today, the Ford Motor Company still stands as a symbol of American industry. It continues to build cars, but also builds toward the future. It has embraced electric vehicles, self-driving technology, and a more sustainable vision of transportation. The company, once led by a man who refused to change, now adapts with the world around it. It learns. It evolves. This, perhaps, is Henry Ford's most enduring lesson, that the future belongs to those who dare to build it, but also to those who dare to learn from the past. His legacy is not simple. It is not clean. It is not made only of success, but it is powerful. Henry Ford was a man of iron and fire, a builder of machines, but also of movements. A dreamer, an inventor, a controller, a father, a fighter, and a man who, like all of us, was deeply human, flawed, brilliant, bold. He showed us that with imagination and effort, one person can move the world forward, and he also showed us that power, if left unchallenged by compassion, can cast long and painful shadows. To study the legacy of Henry Ford is to study progress and the price it sometimes demands. If this story moved you or helped your English, please like, share, and comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to LMJ English to support the channel, so we can continue bringing you more powerful, valuable, and unforgettable stories. Here are 20 key vocabulary words that appear repeatedly throughout the Henry Ford story, along with their explanations in English for learning and understanding. Inventor, a person who creates new devices or methods that have never existed before. Assembly line, a manufacturing process where a product is made step by step as it moves from one worker to another. Factory, a large building where goods are made or assembled using machines and workers. Mechanic, a person who repairs and maintains machines, especially engines and vehicles. Model T, the famous affordable car created by Henry Ford that changed how people lived and traveled. Mass production, the process of making large quantities of a product quickly and efficiently, often using machines. Innovation, a new idea, method, or invention that improves something or creates something new. Gasoline engine, a type of engine that uses gasoline as fuel to power vehicles like cars. Steam engine, an older type of engine that uses steam to create movement or power. Worker, a person who does physical or mental labor, especially in a factory or industrial setting. Wage, the money a worker earns for doing a job, usually paid by the hour or day. Union, an organized group of workers who join together to protect their rights and improve working conditions. Automobile, another word for a car, a vehicle that moves on roads and is powered by an engine. Production, the process of making or creating goods, usually in a factory setting. Investor, a person or group that gives money to a business in hopes of making a profit later. Failure, a lack of success, often used when something doesn't work out as planned. Success, the achievement of a goal or reaching a desired outcome. Legacy, what someone is remembered for after they are gone. The lasting impact of a person's actions. Visionary, a person who sees possibilities and creates plans for the future based on creative thinking. Controversy, a topic that causes strong disagreement, often because it involves serious issues or actions.